In the glass towers of Chicago's financial district, a seasoned compliance officer was about to face corporate betrayal. What started as a routine day finalizing an $80 million federal contract took a shocking turn when they came face to face with executive nepotism at its most ruthless. Monica Reyes wasn't your typical corporate employee. For 22 years, she had spent her life building unbreachable regulatory systems, known for her methodical precision and institutional memory that could survive any leadership change. When she encountered Graham Locke's decision to replace her with his unqualified twin brother, she had no idea they were walking into a digital fortress of their own making. Monica's silence that would lead to systematic corporate destruction. What began as a quiet termination would become regulatory warfare. The entire federal energy industry would never be the same after one embedded audit script exposed the difference between expertise and arrogance. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The cursor blinked on the final line of the environmental impact protocol. I had just opened the secure window to transmit the last layer of verification for an $80 million green energy contract. A deal that took 18 months, 6 site visits and countless late nights to structure. Then the door opened. Graham Locke, the CEO himself, walked in without knocking. He wasn't alone. Behind him was a man who looked exactly like him, same sharp jawline, same expensive suit. But something was different in the eyes where Graham carried calculated confidence. This man had restless energy, desperate to prove something. "Monica," Graham said too casually, "this won't take long." I straightened up in my chair, the secure window still open, my fingers still hovering over the keyboard. "What is it, Graham?" He gave a strange smile, one I'd never seen in 22 years. "We're initiating a leadership transition effective immediately." The words hit like cold water. I blinked, confused. Leadership transition? But I'm 3 days from finalizing the largest compliance review in company history. The environmental audit that would cement Reyes' position as the premier tech utility hybrid in the Midwest. "You've done more than enough," he interrupted, motioning toward the man behind him. "This is Darren, my brother. He'll be taking it from here." Darren stepped forward, extending his hand like we were meeting at a networking event. "Monica, I've heard incredible things about your work here. I'm excited to bring some fresh energy to the compliance division." Fresh energy to compliance. 22 years of building regulatory frameworks, the ground up, and this man with zero corporate experience thinks he can waltz in with fresh energy. I didn't move. The secure window was still open on my monitor, the cursor still blinking patiently next to the line that read "Final authorization required." Graham cleared his throat. "Security will help with the transition. Your belongings will be sent to your residence." My mouth opened, but no sound came out. 22 years. 22 years. I had given to this company. I had drafted every major compliance protocol, built relationships with federal liaisons, trained 3 generations of auditors, and now I was being replaced mid-project by the CEO's twin brother, who'd never filed a regulatory report in his life. As I stood up, my chair still warm, I glanced once more at the screen. The system waited for me. It wouldn't respond to anyone else. Biometric locks, the authorization chains, the embedded verification scripts, all tied to my credentials. But Graham didn't know that. Not yet. "Congratulations, Darren," I said, finally shaking his hand. "I hope you understand what you're walking into." His grip was firm, but his smile flickered slightly. "I'm sure I'll figure it out. Monica, your documentation will be invaluable." Documentation, as if 22 years of institutional knowledge could be reduced to file cabinets and flowcharts. I logged out without closing the system. Then I picked up my blazer and walked out without looking back. The cursor kept blinking behind me, waiting for an authorization that would never come. Graham would figure that out soon enough. The floor was quieter than usual, which was saying something for a compliance department. No one made eye contact. Most of the junior staff pretended to be on calls, typing frantically into keyboards that weren't even connected. The same people who once came to me for guidance on complex regulatory frameworks now couldn't lift their heads. I opened the top drawer of my desk, the one that had held emergency Tylenol, client contact cards, and a small framed photo of the original Orion Core team from 2003. When we were just 40 employees in a converted warehouse, there were only a few things worth taking. Now the rest they could have. A cardboard box was already sitting by my chair, standard issue relocation kit, complete with packing tape and a generic "thank you for your service" card that wasn't even signed. The office manager must have dropped it off while I was still processing my termination. Efficient, cold. No ceremony, no acknowledgement. I moved through the motions, pulling regulatory manuals, client file, a certificate from a federal energy compliance conference in Denver, when I noticed something. My nameplate was gone from the glass wall outside my office, where it once read Monica Reyes, Chief Compliance Officer. A new placard had already been mounted. Graham Locke, Chief Compliance Officer, erased 22 years of service in one afternoon, and replaced it with nepotism disguised as innovation. I didn't cry. I didn't yell. I sat down one last time in my chair and stared at the monitor. I logged in using my admin credentials and pulled up the master directory. I deleted nothing that would hurt the company, but I did clear out every personal training document, memo, and guidance note I'd ever written. The only thing I left untouched was a small silent program buried deep in the system architecture. Audit Lock Final. XCA. It looked like a basic maintenance script. Harmless, forgettable. It housed the biometric encryption protocols needed to authorize final payment releases on major contracts. It couldn't be accessed remotely, it couldn't be overridden, and it couldn't be recoded without a complete system teardown. Only one person could execute it properly, and that person was out the door. As I shut down the screen, a notification pinged in the corner, an alert from the company communications system. Subject line: Welcome Graham Locke, new Chief Compliance Officer. Sender: XCA, Comms, Orion Core. The message was already spreading through the building, bright, cheerful corporate speak about fresh perspectives and innovative approaches. They'd sent it to the entire company, including me by mistake. For a brief second, I imagined responding something short, something that would make them understand what they'd just lost. But I closed the notification instead, box shut, and stood up. My heels echoed across the polished concrete floor as I walked toward the elevator, each step heavier than the last. No one stopped me. No one said goodbye. The bitter taste of dismissal burned in my throat, but I swallowed it down. Let them celebrate. Graham Locke. They had no idea what they'd just locked themselves out of. 48 hours later, the insult compounded. Graham Locke wasn't content with simply replacing me. He wanted to parade the replacement like a trophy at a tech expo. My LinkedIn feed exploded with reshares and congratulatory posts. There he was, sitting at my desk using my coffee mug, even wearing what looked suspiciously like the same brand of reading glasses I kept on my monitor stand. The corporate communications team had outdone themselves with the announcement: Graham Locke brings visionary leadership to Orion Core's compliance division, successfully transitioned the landmark $80 million environmental impact project. His innovative approach will modernize our regulatory framework for the next decade. Innovative approach. The project he'd successfully transitioned was 3 days from completion. When I was forced out, all he'd done was inherit 22 years of groundwork, but the press releases made it sound like he'd built the entire compliance infrastructure from scratch. The photos were particularly galling. Darren posed thoughtfully at my whiteboard, where complex regulatory flowcharts still mapped out the final audit requirements. He hadn't erased them. He was using them as props in his corporate headshots. Tamika Holloway, the new internal auditor hired just 6 weeks ago, was the first to notice something wasn't quite right. She'd been assigned to review the environmental impact documentation before the federal audit scheduled for the following week. Standard procedure, except nothing about the file structure was standard. the system keeps asking for additional authorization. She mentioned to Darren during their first meeting, every time I try to access the core compliance protocols, it prompts for something called origin terminal verification. Darren waved her concerns away with practiced confidence. Legacy systems always have quirks, Tamika. We're modernize everything. Anyway, let's focus on the big picture here. He pulled up a sleek presentation titled Project Revive Compliance for the Future, where he'd rebranded my environmental impact work as his visionary initiative. See, this is about more than just meeting regulatory requirements. We're creating a template for sustainable corporate responsibility. The buzzwords flowed like water from a broken dam: sustainable synergy, proactive paradigms, disruptive compliance frameworks. Tamika nodded politely, but privately wondered how someone could discuss regulatory compliance for 30 minutes without mentioning a single actual regulation. Meanwhile, Darren basked in the attention scheduling photo ops with the marketing team and agreeing to speak at an upcoming tech leadership conference about revolutionizing corporate governance. Behind the glossy presentation, however, the systems were starting to fracture. Tamika discovered that several key documents were locked in read-only mode, preventing any modifications to the final audit package. When she brought this to the IT department, they seemed genuinely confused. We've never seen authorization protocols this complex, admitted Jake Torres, the senior systems administrator. It's like the previous compliance officer built some kind of fortress around the core files. Fortress that was exactly what I'd built over 2 decades, layer upon layer of protective protocols, ensuring that no one could alter critical compliance data without proper authorization. But Darren interpreted every system roadblock as a challenge to overcome rather than a safeguard to respect. We need to move fast on this, he told the IT team during an emergency meeting. The federal audit is next week, and we can't look like we're fumbling with outdated technology. Jake reluctantly agreed to attempt what he called a soft override on some of the less critical file restrictions. It worked for basic document training materials, procedural notes, things that didn't matter. But when Darren tried to make his first significant change, updating a compliance timeline to reflect his compressed review schedule, the system rejected his authorization outright error message. Unauthorized modification attempt. Administrative override required contact Reyes for verification. Who's Reyes? Darren asked the room. No one answered, because everyone knew exactly who Reyes was, and everyone knew she wasn't coming back to help him. The silence stretched uncomfortably until Tamika cleared her throat. That would be Monica Reyes, the previous chief compliance officer. Darren's confident smile faltered for just a moment before snapping back into place. Well, obviously we need to get IT to transfer her credentials. This is just a technical hiccup. But it wasn't just a technical hiccup, and it wasn't going away. Jake spent the next day trying to locate the source of the authorization locks buried deep in the system architecture. He found references to something called Audit Lock Finals, but every attempt to access or modify the program triggered additional security prompts. It's like she built a digital vault, he reported to Darren, and she took the combination with her. Meanwhile, Tamika continued her review, becoming increasingly concerned about what she was finding. Environmental impact project was massive, complex, involving multiple federal agencies, state regulatory bodies, and international compliance standards. Monica's documentation was meticulous. Every decision justified, every protocol explained, every contingency planned. But now, with Darren pushing for rapid changes to meet his own timeline, Tamika could see cracks forming in the carefully constructed framework. We shouldn't be rushing this, she warned during another meeting. Some of these regulatory requirements have specific timing windows. If we modify the submission schedule, we might invalidate months of prior approvals. Darren bristled at the suggestion that his timeline might be problematic. Tamika, I appreciate your attention to detail, but we need to think bigger picture here. We're not just following old protocols, we're setting new standards for the industry. He authorized another round of modifications, this time to the executive summary of the Environmental Impact Report standard. Corporate optimization, he called it, making the language more dynamic, more forward-thinking. What he actually did was remove several detailed technical sections that he couldn't understand, replacing them with generic statements about innovation and sustainability. The system accepted some changes, rejected others, seemingly at random, creating a patchwork document that satisfied neither regulatory requirements nor corporate messaging goals. But Darren pressed forward, convinced that his vision would overcome any technical obstacles. "Sometimes you have to break a few eggs to make an omelet," he told his assistant while scheduling interviews with trade publications about his revolutionary approach to compliance management. What he didn't realize was that every rejected modification, every authorization error, every system hiccup was being logged in, a hidden audit trail, one that would soon tell a very different story about his revolutionary leadership. Timika Holloway had always been curious about systems, especially systems that seemed designed to hide their own complexity. The more she dug into Orion Corps' compliance infrastructure, the more she realized she was looking at something extraordinary, not just software, architecture built by someone who understood that regulatory compliance wasn't about checking boxes, it was about creating unbreakable chains of accountability. Every file, every protocol, every authorization pathway had been crafted with surgical precision. The errors were multiplying daily. Now started as occasional hiccups had become a cascade of system rejections. Darren's modifications triggered warnings throughout the network database, locks, file corruption alerts, authorization failures that seemed to anticipate his every move. "It's like the system is fighting back," Jake Torres confided to Timika during a late-night troubleshooting session. "Every time we try to implement his changes, something else breaks." Timika had been studying the error logs for 3 days, searching for patterns. What she found was more sophisticated than any corporate security system she'd ever encountered. The compliance infrastructure wasn't just protecting files, it was protecting integrity. Every document existed in multiple verified copies, every change required cascading authorizations from related systems, every modification left digital fingerprints that couldn't be erased. "This isn't just compliance software," she realized. "This is forensic architecture." Buried in the deepest layers of the system, she found references to something Monica had called the audit trail, not just a record of changes, but a living document that tracked the logic behind every decision, rationale for every protocol, the justification for every safeguard. It was like Monica had built a digital memoir of 22 years of regulatory expertise, embedded in the code itself. Whenever Darren made changes that contradicted established protocols, the system didn't just reject them, documented why they were problematic, creating a growing record of incompetence, disguised as innovation. The breakthrough came when Timika discovered a hidden directory labeled contingency protocols. Inside, she found detailed documentation for something called leadership transition safeguards. Monica had actually anticipated this scenario, the possibility that someone unqualified might someday take over compliance operations, and had built protections accordingly. In the event of administrative transition, without proper knowledge transfer. One document read, "System will maintain operational continuity while documenting all modification attempts for regulatory review." Regulatory review. The words sent a chill through Timika's spine. Monica hadn't just built safeguards against incompetence, she'd built evidence collectors. Every one of Darren's failed modifications, every shortcut he'd attempted, every protocol he'd ignored, was being systematically documented in formats designed for federal oversight. The $80 million environmental impact project wasn't just protected by authorization locks, it was surrounded by digital witnesses would testify to any attempt at regulatory fraud. Timika tried to discuss her findings with Leo Park, the head of legal affairs, but Leo seemed more interested in damage control than damage prevention. "Look, Timika, I appreciate your thoroughness, but we need to focus on solutions here, not problems. Federal audit is next week, and we can't afford to look incompetent." When she mentioned the forensic architecture embedded in Monica's systems, Leo's expression shifted from dismissive to concerned. "Forensic architecture? What exactly are you talking about?" She showed him the documentation, the hidden audit trails, the authorization logs that couldn't be deleted, the systematic recording of every modification attempt. Leo studied the screen for several minutes, his face growing pale. "This is comprehensive," he admitted. "If federal auditors review these logs, they'll see everything, every change Darren attempted, every protocol he ignored, every safeguard he tried to bypass." Timika nodded. "And they'll want to know why the previous compliance officer built these protections in the first place." Meanwhile, Darren remained obliviously confident in his revolutionary approach. He'd scheduled a company-wide presentation for Friday afternoon to showcase his modernized compliance framework. The marketing team had prepared glossy materials, highlighting his innovative leadership. The communications department had drafted press releases about OrionCore's bold new direction in regulatory management. What none of them realized was that every day brought new system failures, new authorization errors, new digital evidence of the gap between Darren's public confidence and his private incompetence. The first external sign of trouble came Tuesday morning when Colin Reyes, the federal compliance liaison, called for a preliminary review. "We've received some unusual automated reports from your compliance monitoring system," he told Leo during a brief phone call. "Nothing urgent, just some data integrity alerts that we'd like to clarify before the formal audit next week." Leo's blood pressure spiked. Data integrity alerts meant the systems were communicating directly with federal oversight bodies, reporting problems without human intervention. Monica had built the equivalent of a regulatory panic button, and Darren's fumbling had triggered it. Timika spent Tuesday night reading through Monica's documentation, searching for some way to contain the damage. What she found instead was a masterclass in regulatory strategy. Monica hadn't just protected the compliance systems she'd created, a complete record of institutional knowledge, every major decision over 22 years. Every regulatory relationship, every hard-won approval, every carefully negotiated settlement. It was all there, documented, cross-referenced, and protected by the same authorization locks that were now preventing Darren from making changes. Wednesday morning brought news that made Leo's stomach drop. Colin Reyes wanted to move the audit up to Friday, not because of any specific concern, he explained, but because the automated reports suggested some unusual activity in the compliance monitoring systems. "Just want to make sure everything's running smoothly before you finalize that environmental impact project," he said in his characteristic understated way. What he didn't say was that federal compliance liaisons don't move audits up unless they suspect something significant is wrong. Darren received the news with typical bravado. "Actually, this is perfect timing. We'll get to showcase the new systems ahead of schedule." But privately, he was beginning to panic. The environmental impact project was nowhere near ready for federal review. His modifications had created a document that satisfied neither regulatory requirements nor corporate objectives. Systems continued to reject his authorization attempts with increasing frequency. The digital fortress Monica had built around 22 years of regulatory expertise was holding firm, and Darren was running out of time to break through its walls. Thursday evening, Timika made a decision that would change everything. She sat down at her computer, opened an encrypted email account, and typed a simple message. "MS Reyes. I'm the new internal auditor at OrionCore. I think there are some things about your compliance systems that you might want to know." She hesitated for several minutes before hitting send, wondering if she was crossing a line that could end her career. But, as she looked around the office at the chaos that Darren's incompetence was creating, she realized some lines were worth crossing, especially when the alternative was watching 22 years of regulatory expertise destroyed by nepotism and arrogance. The email disappeared into the digital void, but Timika felt certain it would find its target. Monica Reyes might have been forced out of OrionCore. But she hadn't disappeared, and based on what Timika had learned about the systems Monica had built, she was probably still watching, still protecting the company that had discarded her, still ensuring that regulatory compliance meant more than just corporate theater. The audit was tomorrow, and Darren was about to discover that some foundations can't be demolished without bringing down everything built on top of them. Monica Reyes sat in her kitchen Friday morning reading Tamika's email for the fourth time. The words glowed on her laptop screen like a confession. Nemes Reyes, I'm the new internal auditor at Orion Corp. I think there are some things about your compliance systems that you might want to know. She'd been expecting this moment for 6 days. Ever since she walked out of that building, leaving behind 2 decades of digital architecture designed to protect itself from exactly what Graham Locke was trying to do. She didn't reply to Tamika's message directly that would create a paper trail that could implicate both of them. Instead, she opened a secure terminal window and typed a command she hadn't used in a week: Audit Monitor. Activate. Stealth. The screen flickered once, then displayed a simple message: monitoring resumed. Orion Core Compliance Network. Monica had built this backdoor years ago during a particularly contentious federal review. A way to observe system activity without leaving fingerprints. She'd never told anyone about it, not even Graham Locke. Some tools were too dangerous to share. Meanwhile, at Orion Corp headquarters, Darren was discovering that confidence couldn't override encryption. The federal audit was scheduled for Monday. Colin Reyes had called Thursday evening to confirm the accelerated timeline, and Darren still couldn't access the core environmental impact protocol. Every attempt triggered the same infuriating message: authorization locked. Contact M. Reyes for verification. He'd spent Thursday night screaming at the IT department, demanding they find a way around Monica's digital fortress. But Jake Torres could only shake his head. Mr. Locke, she didn't just build security systems, she built a maze, every protection layer. References 3 others. If we try to force our way through, we might corrupt the entire database. Tamika watched the chaos with growing alarm. Darren had scheduled a final review meeting for Friday afternoon to prepare for Monday's audit, but half the required documentation was either locked or corrupted by his modification attempts. The environmental impact project that Monica had spent 18 months perfecting was falling apart under 3 days of Darren's leadership. We need to contact Monica Reyes, Tamika suggested during the morning briefing. She's the only one who can unlock these systems. Darren's face flushed red. Absolutely not. We're not going crawling back to someone who clearly sabotaged these systems before leaving. This is corporate terrorism, and I won't reward it. Leo shifted uncomfortably in his chair. He'd been reviewing the legal implications of Monday's audit all week, and the picture wasn't pretty. Darren, the federal compliance liaison, specifically asked about system integrity. If we can't demonstrate proper authorization chains for our environmental protocol, the entire contract could be suspended. And the word hung in the air like smoke from an electrical fire. $80 million in federal contracts didn't just disappear, they got transferred to competitors who could demonstrate competent regulatory compliance. Darren stood up abruptly. We'll demonstrate competence without Monica Reyes. This company doesn't need her legacy systems. We'll build new ones. Tamika stared at him in disbelief. In 3 days, you want to rebuild 18 months of environmental impact documentation in 3 days? But Darren was already lost in his own rhetoric about innovation and disruption, as if regulatory compliance was just another startup problem that could be solved with enthusiasm and corporate buzzwords. He spent Friday afternoon recording video testimonials about his visionary leadership, while Tamika frantically tried to salvage what remained of the environmental impact documentation. Every file she accessed triggered new authorization errors. Every change she attempted was blocked by systems that seemed to anticipate her every move. Monica's laptop chimed softly. Friday evening. A new alert from the monitoring system. Unauthorized approval attempt. Graham Locke, admin. She clicked on the details and almost laughed, despite everything. Darren had tried to authorize final contract submission using administrative privileges granted himself, but Monica's systems didn't recognize corporate hierarchy. They recognized expertise, competence, and proper authorization chains. Darren Locke possessed none of those things. The system had rejected his approval attempt and automatically flagged it for federal review. Her phone buzzed with a text from her niece. Camila, Aunt Monica saw the news about Orion Corps' new compliance chief. Are you okay? Camila worked as a junior developer at a competing energy firm and had always looked up to Monica's career trajectory. I'm fine. Mija, just watching from the sideline now. Monica typed back. But even as she sent the message, she wondered if that was entirely true. The monitoring system was showing increased activity. Friday night, Darren was making desperate attempts to bypass authorization locks, while Tamika was working late trying to piece together a coherent audit package from the fragments he'd left behind. Saturday morning brought news that made Monica's coffee taste bitter. Colin Reyes had scheduled a preliminary review for Sunday afternoon. Just want to walk through the documentation before Monday's formal audit. He'd told Leo Park during a Saturday phone call that woke the legal department's head from uneasy sleep. Colin was being polite, but Monica recognized the subtext. Federal compliance. Liaisons didn't work weekends, unless they suspected major problems. Sunday afternoon meant Colin had received the automated flags from her monitoring systems, wanted to investigate before the situation escalated further. Camila called Saturday evening, her voice tight with barely controlled anger. Aunt Monica, I just heard through the industry network that they're claiming the environmental impact project was Darren's initiative from the beginning, saying, you were just supporting staff. Monica closed her eyes, feeling the familiar burn of institutional erasure. It doesn't matter what they claim, Mija. The systems know the truth. But it did matter, at least to Camila, who had grown up watching her aunt navigate corporate politics with quiet dignity, only to see that dignity trampled by nepotism and corporate image management. Sunday morning, Monica made coffee and opened her laptop one final time. The monitoring system showed frantic activity overnight. Darren had attempted 17 different authorization bypasses, all rejected, all logged, automatically forwarded to federal oversight databases. He was creating a digital trail of incompetence that would be impossible to explain away. Meanwhile, Tamika had worked through the night, trying to compile an audit package from the pieces she could access. Her efforts were methodical, professional, ultimately futile without proper authorization chains. The environmental impact documentation looked like what it was: a ransacked filing cabinet missing critical components. The final ping came Sunday at noon. Federal compliance review initiated. Automated systems reporting. Monica stared at the alert, knowing exactly what it meant. Colin Reyes wasn't just conducting a preliminary review. He was following up on automated integrity reports that her systems had been sending for days. Every authorization failure, every modification attempt, every bypassed protocol had been quietly documented, transmitted to federal databases. The $80 million environmental impact project wasn't just falling apart. It was creating evidence of regulatory fraud in real time. Monica closed the laptop and walked to her kitchen window. Overlooking the Chicago skyline, Orion Corps' headquarters gleamed in the distance, its glass facade reflecting Sunday afternoon sunlight with corporate optimism. But inside that building, Darren Locke was about to discover that some systems couldn't be disrupted, some foundations couldn't be modernized, and some legacies couldn't be deleted by executive decree. The monitor system would continue its silent work, documenting every failure, every shortcut, every moment of incompetence, masquerading as innovation. Tomorrow, Colin Reyes would arrive with questions that Darren couldn't answer and authorization requirements that he couldn't meet. The audit would expose everything, and Monica wouldn't have to say a single word. The systems she'd built over 22 years would speak for themselves, with digital precision and regulatory authority that no corporate title could override. Colin Reyes arrived at Orion Corps Monday morning, carrying a briefcase that looked older than some of the employees. a weathered leather portfolio that had seen dozens of federal audits across multiple industries. He walked with the unhurried pace of someone who understood that compliance problems revealed themselves in their own time. No amount of corporate urgency could accelerate the discovery of regulatory fraud, but it could certainly make the evidence more obvious. Darren had prepared for this moment with typical theatrical flair. He'd scheduled the audit meeting in the executive conference room, complete with catered breakfast and a multimedia presentation about Orion Corp's innovative approach to environmental compliance. The marketing team had prepared glossy folders, highlighting the company's commitment to sustainable energy solutions. Each folder contained carefully selected excerpts from the Environmental Impact Project with Darren's name prominently featured project lead. But Colin wasn't interested in marketing materials. He was interested in authorization chains. Let's start with the baseline documentation, Colin said, settling into his chair with practiced efficiency. I'd like to review the original environmental impact assessment filed with 8 months ago. Then we'll walk through each modification approval and authorization pathway to current status. Tamika felt her stomach clench. She'd spent the weekend trying to piece together exactly that timeline, and the results were catastrophic. Darren's modifications had created gaps in the approval chain that made the current documentation legally indefensible. Darren launched into his presentation with corporate enthusiasm. Colin, what you're going to see today represents a complete transformation of how we approach regulatory compliance. We've moved beyond the old paradigm of bureaucratic box checking to create a dynamic framework that adapts to changing industry standards. Colin nodded politely, but his attention was focused on the documents. Tamika was distributing thick folders that should have contained comprehensive regulatory histories, but instead held patchwork collections of incomplete forms and authorization gaps. I'm seeing some inconsistencies in the modification approval dates, Colin observed after reviewing the first section. This environmental assessment shows final authorization dated last Tuesday, but the supporting documentation references approvals from 6 months ago. Tamika exchanged glances with Leo Park, who had been dreading exactly this question. There were some system updates during the leadership transition, Leo offered weakly. We're in the process of reconciling the documentation. Colin's expression didn't change, but made a note that looked ominous in its brevity. Federal compliance liaisons didn't write much down during audits, but when they did, it usually meant someone was going to receive uncomfortable follow-up questions. I'd like to see the original authorization structure, he said, particularly the approval pathways for final contract submission. Darren's confident smile flickered slightly. Of course, we'll get you those files right away. Tamika can walk you through our modernized approval process. But Tamika couldn't walk anyone through anything because the approval process was trapped behind authorization locks that only Monica Reyes could open. Every attempt to access the core protocols triggered the same infuriating error message, and every error was being logged in. Systems that seemed designed to document incompetence. Colin spent an hour reviewing what documentation they could provide before asking the question that made Darren's palms sweat. Who has administrative authority over these compliance systems? I do, Darren said quickly. As Chief Compliance Officer, I have full administrative access. Colin nodded and pulled out a tablet. Excellent. Then you can demonstrate the authorization pathway for final contract approval. I'd like to see the complete chain from initial assessment through federal submission. The conference room fell silent, except for the hum of air conditioning and the distant sound of Chicago traffic. Darren stared at the tablet, knowing that any attempt to demonstrate authorization would trigger system errors that would expose his complete lack of technical competence. There might be some minor technical issues with the new systems, he said lamely. We're in transition period between legacy platforms and modernized infrastructure. Colin's eyebrows rose slightly in his 20 years of federal oversight. He'd heard every excuse for system failures, but watching a chief compliance officer, unable to demonstrate basic authorization access, was relatively novel. Perhaps we should involve your IT department, he suggested. System architecture issues can usually be resolved quickly. Jake Torres arrived looking like he'd been summoned to a firing squad, which, many ways he had Colin's questions were precise and technical, focused on the kinds of system capabilities that separated legitimate compliance infrastructure from corporate theater. Can you show me the audit trail for modifications made to the environmental impact documentation over the past week? Jake's face went pale. Sir, the audit trail is protected by authorization locks that we can't currently access. Authorization locks. Colin made another note, and Tamika realized the situation was spiraling beyond damage control. Who implemented these authorization locks? Colin asked, and answered without thinking. Monica Reyes, the previous chief compliance officer. She built most of our compliance infrastructure over the past 2 decades. The silence that followed was deafening. Darren's face cycled through several shades of red, while Leo Park looked like he was calculating liability in real time. I see, Colin said in the understated tone that federal officials used when they encountered something genuinely problematic. And where is Ms. Reyes' current? Graham Locke, who had been silent throughout the morning session, finally spoke. Monica is no longer with the company. She was replaced as part of our leadership modernization initiative. Colin nodded thoughtfully. When did this transition occur? The answer hung in the air like an accusation. Last Monday, sir. 6 days ago. 6 days before a federal audit. Colin wrote extensively this time, filling half a page with notes that nobody else could read but everyone understood. Meant trouble. I'm going to need to postpone the formal compliance review, he announced. There appear to be some system integrity issues that need to be resolved before we can proceed with contract authorization. Postponed was federal speak for suspended, which was federal speak for Reyes Corps' $80 million environmental contract was now in serious jeopardy. After Colin left, the conference room erupted in recriminations. Graham accused Darren of mismanaging the transition. Darren blamed IT for not resolving the authorization issues. Leo suggested they contact Monica immediately to request system access. Tamika sat quietly wondering if her anonymous email to Monica contributed to this disaster, but also feeling oddly satisfied that someone had finally acknowledged the institutional knowledge that Darren had dismissed so casually. Meanwhile, across town, Monica was reading news coverage of a Reyes Corps' postponed federal audit. Camila had forwarded 3 industry blog posts about compliance failures and leadership transitions. The coverage was brutal but accurate, highlighting the gap between Darren's public claims about innovative leadership and his apparent inability to demonstrate basic system competence. One blogger had titled his analysis, "How to Destroy Regulatory Credibility in 6 Days," and Monica found herself almost feeling sorry for Graham Locke, who had traded 2 decades of institutional expertise for corporate nepotism. But sympathy was a luxury. Monica couldn't afford the monitoring system was showing increased federal activity. Audit compliance reports were being generated every few hours, documenting system access attempts and authorization failures. The $80 million environmental contract wasn't just postponed. It was creating a federal paper trail that would follow Reyes Corps for years. Every failed authorization attempt, every bypassed protocol, every modification error was being systematically reported to oversight databases that never forgot corporate incompetence. Tuesday morning brought news that made the situation exponentially worse. Colin Reyes had escalated the audit findings to his supervisors, who had escalated them to the Federal Energy Oversight Committee, which had suspended all pending contract authorizations, with Reyes Corps pending a comprehensive review of their compliance infrastructure. The company that had dismissed Monica Reyes for being too slow and methodical was now facing federal investigation for being too fast and reckless. The irony would have been amusing if it weren't destroying careers and threatening jobs across the organization. The story broke Wednesday morning when Camila Reyes made a decision that would haunt her conscience and vindicate her principles. She'd spent Tuesday nights reading through industry forums where Reyes Corps' audit suspension was being discussed with the kind of technical detail that only insiders could provide. Someone was leaking information about the compliance failures, and Camila had a pretty good idea who that someone might be. At the final straw cave, when she found a forum post claiming that Monica had sabotaged the systems before leaving to damage the company's reputation. Sabotage. Camila stared at the accusation, feeling anger burn through her chest like acid. Her aunt had dedicated 22 years to building regulatory infrastructure, protected Arrayancourt from exactly the kind of disasters they were now experiencing. The suggestion that Monica would deliberately harm the company was both insulting and ignorant, revealing how little these industry commentators understood about professional integrity or system architecture. Sabotage implied malicious intent, but what Monica had built was defensive, not offensive. The decision came in a moment of crystalline fury. Camila opened her work laptop and began typing an email to Sarah Chen, the technology reporter at Energy Weekly who specialized in corporate governance failures. Subject line was simple: Arrayancourt compliance crisis, internal documents available. But the content was devastating: a detailed explanation of Monica's forced removal, the system authorization locks, and the mounting evidence of regulatory incompetence that was being automatically documented in federal oversight systems. Attached to the email were screenshots of error logs that Camila had received from a concerned source inside Arrayancourt. The logs showed dozens of failed authorization attempts, each one timestamped and logged with technical precision. Authorization denied. Insufficient credentials appeared repeatedly, followed by increasingly desperate attempts to bypass security protocols. The final entry was particularly damning: federal compliance alert, multiple unauthorized modification attempts detected. Sarah Chen published the story Thursday morning under the headline, "How a Compliance Legend's Digital Fortress Exposed Corporate Nepotism." The article detailed Monica's career trajectory from intern to chief compliance officer, the institutional knowledge she'd accumulated over 2 decades, and the sophisticated systems she'd built to protect Arrayancourt's regulatory standing. Then, it described Darren Locke's appointment and the subsequent cascade of system failures that had triggered federal intervention. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. But the most devastating part of the article was the error log analysis. Sarah had consulted with cybersecurity experts who explained that the authorization failures weren't random technical glitches. They were evidence of systematic attempts to bypass regulatory safeguards. These logs show some trying to force changes to compliance documentation without proper oversight. One expert explained, "It's like trying to perform surgery without medical training. The systems are rejecting the modifications because they don't meet professional standards." By Thursday afternoon, story had spread across industry publications and social media platforms. Monica Reyes began trending on professional networking sites, where regulatory compliance professionals shared their own stories of being dismissed for institutional knowledge that companies couldn't quantify. This is what happens when you replace expertise with connections. Read one widely shared post: 22 years of regulatory knowledge doesn't transfer through PowerPoint presentations. Darren Locke tried to control the narrative with a hastily arranged video conference, where he blamed disgruntled former employees spreading misinformation about Arrayancourt's compliance capabilities. But his performance was wooden and defensive, particularly when reporters asked technical questions about authorization protocols and system architecture. "We're confident in our compliance infrastructure," he repeated like a mantra while avoiding any discussion of the federal audit suspension. The video conference became a public relations disaster when a reporter asked Darren to explain the difference between environmental impact assessments and regulatory compliance frameworks. Darren's answer was a rambling collection of corporate buzzwords that revealed his fundamental lack of understanding about the regulatory processes he was supposedly leading. Innovation in compliance means breaking down silos between traditional assessment paradigms and dynamic sustainability metrics, he said. Meant nothing to anyone with actual regulatory experience. Meanwhile, Monica was reading the coverage from her kitchen table with complicated emotions. The vindication felt good after 6 days of watching her life's work being dismissed as outdated bureaucracy. But she also worried about the impact of Arrayancourt's employees who had nothing to do with Graham's decision to prioritize nepotism over competence. The company's stock price had dropped 12% since the audit suspension, and rumors were circulating about potential federal investigations that could affect hundreds of jobs. Friday morning brought news that crystallized the entire situation. Reyes released a preliminary report stating that Orioncor's compliance systems showed significant architectural sophistication, but had been compromised by unauthorized modification attempts that triggered automatic federal oversight protocols. The report specifically noted that the original system designer appeared to have anticipated leadership transitions and built safeguards accordingly, creating what Collin described as a digital audit trail that maintains integrity, regardless of administrative changes. Report was bureaucratic language, but the implications were clear. Monica's systems hadn't failed. They had succeeded exactly as designed, protecting regulatory integrity by documenting and reporting attempts to bypass proper authorization procedures. Darren's modifications hadn't been blocked by technical glitches. They'd been blocked by professional standards embedded in software architecture that refused to compromise on regulatory compliance. The error logs weren't evidence of system failure. They were evidence of system success. Leo Park spent Friday afternoon fielding calls from reporters asking about the company's plans to restore compliance credibility. "We're confident that this situation will be resolved quickly," he told each caller while privately calculating the legal liability that Orioncore faced if federal investigators determined that the company had attempted to submit fraudulent compliance documentation. The environmental impact contract wasn't just suspended, it was potentially evidence in a federal investigation of regulatory fraud. By Friday evening, the industry consensus was clear. Orioncore had created a textbook case study in how not to manage leadership transitions, particularly in highly regulated industries. The decision to replace an experienced compliance chief with an unqualified family member, days before a federal audit, would be analyzed in business schools and regulatory conferences for years to come. As an example of corporate arrogance leading to institutional disaster, but for Monica, the real satisfaction wasn't in the public vindication. It was in the knowledge that her systems had worked exactly as intended, protecting regulatory integrity, even when the company that employed her couldn't recognize the value of what she'd built. The weekend brought reflection and planning, while Orioncore's leadership scrambled to contain a crisis that grew more serious with each passing day. Monica began receiving calls from former colleagues and industry contacts who had read the coverage and wanted to express their support, but also to explore possibilities for collaboration. Several federal agencies were apparently interested in consulting with someone who understood how to build compliance systems that could maintain integrity during leadership transitions. The skills that Orioncore had dismissed as outdated were suddenly in high demand across an industry that had watched Monica's digital fortress expose the difference between regulatory compliance and regulatory theater. Monday morning, Graham Locke sat in his corner office, staring at 3 separate crisis management reports that painted the same picture. Orioncore was hemorrhaging credibility faster than their legal team could draft damage control statements. The Federal Oversight Committee had expanded their investigation to include potential regulatory fraud charges. The Environmental Protection Agency had suspended all pending contract authorizations, and the Securities Exchange Commission was asking uncomfortable questions about disclosure requirements related to compliance. Leadership changes, the final straw came. In the form of an encrypted email forwarded by Jake Torres from the IT forensics team. "Mr. Locke, you need to see this immediately." The attachment contained a comprehensive audit trail extracted from the compliance systems, showing not just Darren's failed authorization attempts, but evidence that he had tried to forge digital signatures on federal compliance documents. The timestamps were damning. Tuesday through Friday of the previous week, Darren had systematically attempted to bypass every safeguard Monica had built, culminating in an attempt to submit fraudulent environmental impact documentation to federal agencies. Perjury. Graham stared at the screen, feeling his carefully constructed corporate empire crumbling around him. Darren hadn't just failed to understand Monica's systems, He had actively tried to circumvent them in ways that constituted federal crimes. The digital evidence was comprehensive and unalterable, every attempted modification preserved with forensic precision, by systems that seemed designed to document exactly this kind of institutional betrayal. The $80 million environmental contract was no longer just suspended, it was evidence in a potential criminal investigation. Leo Park arrived at Graham's office, carrying a briefcase full of legal documentation and the expression of someone who had spent the weekend calculating liability exposure. "We need to discuss immediate containment strategies," he said, settling into the chair across from Graham's desk. "The federal investigators are requesting complete system access and documentation of all compliance modifications made since Monica's departure." Graham nodded, knowing exactly what that meant. Every failed authorization attempt, every bypassed protocol, every forged signature would be laid bare for federal review. "What are our options?" Graham asked, though he suspected the answer would be limited and unpalatable. Leo opened his briefcase and pulled out a thick folder. "Honestly, Graham, our best option might be complete cooperation. We could argue that Darren exceeded his authority and acted without proper oversight, but that defense only works if we can demonstrate that the company has legitimate compliance infrastructure." The implication was clear. They needed Monica's cooperation to prove that Orion Corps' regulatory failures were the result of individual incompetence, rather than institutional corruption. The irony was suffocating. Graham had fired Monica to bring in fresh leadership that would modernize the company's regulatory approach. Now he needed her expertise to prove that the company wasn't fundamentally corrupt. The digital fortress she had built over 20 years was the only thing standing between Orion Corps and complete regulatory collapse, but Monica Reyes was under no obligation to help the company that had dismissed her institutional knowledge as outdated bureaucracy. Meanwhile, across town, Monica was fielding calls from federal investigators who wanted to understand the technical architecture of the compliance systems they were reviewing. "Miss Reyes, your authorization protocols are remarkably sophisticated," admitted Special Agent Karen Wright during a two-afternoon phone conference. "We're trying to understand whether the modification attempts we're seeing represent systematic fraud or individual incompetence." Monica chose her words carefully, knowing that her answer could determine whether Orion Corps faced civil penalties or criminal charges. "The systems were designed to maintain regulatory integrity during personnel transitions," Monica explained. "Every modification attempt is logged and evaluated against established compliance standards. If someone tries to bypass proper authorization, the systems document and report those attempts automatically." Agent Wright made notes that Monica couldn't see but could imagine detailed technical questions about digital forensics and evidence preservation that would become central to any federal case against Orion Corps. Wednesday afternoon brought news that made Graham's situation exponentially worse. Colin Rue had identified Monica's digital signature embedded throughout the compliance infrastructure, not just as author but as ongoing administrator. Every system protection, every authorization lock, every forensic audit trail bore her electronic fingerprint, proving that regulatory safeguards weren't corporate policy. They were personal architecture built by someone who understood that compliance meant more than paperwork submission. The revelation triggered a cascade of uncomfortable realizations throughout Orion Corps' leadership team. Tamika Holloway confirmed that Monica's administrative credentials were still active in the system, meaning she had ongoing access to every compliance database, every federal filing, every piece of evidence that federal investigators were requesting. She could have disabled everything when she left, Tamika reported during an emergency executive meeting, but she didn't. She left the systems intact and operational, which meant Monica had been watching Orion Corps' compliance meltdown in real time, through monitoring systems that gave her administrative oversight of every failed authorization attempt, every bypassed protocol, every moment of incompetence that Darren had displayed while trying to manage regulatory processes. He fundamentally didn't understand the woman they had dismissed for being too methodical, had been documenting their failures with methodical precision. A Thursday morning, Graham made the call he had been dreading since the federal investigation began. "Monica, this is Graham Locke. I know the circumstances of your departure were difficult, but the company needs your help with the federal compliance review." The silence on the other end of the line stretched for several seconds before Monica responded with characteristic precision. "What specifically are you asking for, Graham?" What he was asking for was salvation, the kind of institutional expertise that couldn't be replaced by corporate restructuring or executive hiring. The compliance systems that federal investigators were reviewing weren't just software, they were the digital embodiment of Monica's regulatory knowledge, accumulated over 2 decades of managing environmental compliance for one of Chicago's largest tech utility companies. "We need system access," Graham admitted. "The federal investigators require complete documentation of compliance modifications, and we can't provide that without your authorization." "I see," Monica said, and Graham could hear the satisfaction in her voice, not vindictive pleasure, but professional satisfaction at watch systems work exactly as designed. "And what makes you think I should provide that authorization?" "Graham, you made it clear last week that my expertise was no longer valued at Orion Corp." The question hung between them like an indictment. Graham had prioritized family loyalty over institutional competence, and now he was discovering that expertise couldn't be replaced by enthusiasm. Friday afternoon, Monica agreed to meet with Orion Corp's legal team, not to help them, but to clarify the terms under which she might consider cooperation. "I built those systems to protect regulatory integrity," she told Leo Park during a brief phone conference. "If federal investigators want access to understand how compliance should work, I'm willing to facilitate that, but I won't help Orion Corp avoid responsibility for dismantling institutional safeguards." The distinction was crucial. Monica would cooperate with federal oversight, but not with corporate damage control. She would explain how the systems worked and why they had documented Darren's failures, but she wouldn't provide authorization for modifications that might obscure evidence of regulatory incompetence. The digital fortress she had built would remain intact, protecting not just compliance integrity, but the evidence of what happened when expertise was replaced by nepotism. The meeting was scheduled for Monday morning, and Graham knew that Monica would arrive holding all the cards in a game where Orion Corp had already lost. Monday morning, Monica Reyes walked into Orion Corp's conference room, carrying a leather portfolio that contained 22 years of documentation and the quiet confidence of someone who had been proven absolutely right about everything. She had spent the weekend reviewing federal investigators' questions and preparing responses that would clarify the technical architecture without compromising the evidence that Darren's incompetence had created. She wore the same navy blazer she had worn to her termination meeting, but this time she was setting the terms. Graham Locke sat at the head of the conference table, flanked by Leo Park and 2 attorneys from the corporate crisis management firm that Orion Corp had hired to navigate the federal investigation. Tamika Holloway was present as the internal auditor who had first identified the system authorization problems, and Colin Reyes attended via video conference as the federal compliance liaison overseeing the investigation. The power dynamics had shifted completely since Monica's last meeting in this room. "Thank you for coming, Monica," Graham began, but Monica cut him off with a raised hand. "Let's be clear about why I'm here, Graham. I'm here to help Orion Corp avoid consequences for poor decision-making. I'm here to ensure that federal investigators understand how regulatory compliance systems should function, and what happens when qualified personnel are replaced by unqualified family members." The attorneys exchanged glances, recognizing that Monica was controlling the narrative from the opening statement. Leo Park opened his briefcase and pulled out a thick stack of documentation. "Monica, we've prepared a consulting agreement that would formalize your cooperation with the federal review. The terms are quite generous, including full restoration of your previous compensation level and acknowledgement of your contributions to Orion Corps' compliance infrastructure. Monica glanced at the documents without touching them. I don't want consulting fees. Leo, I want clarity about what actually happened here. What actually happened was a masterclass in institutional destruction. Graham had prioritized image over expertise, resulting in the systematic dismantling of regulatory safeguards that had protected Orion Corps for 2 decades. Monica pulled out her own documentation and began walking through the technical architecture with forensic precision. The compliance systems I built include multiple authorization layers, designed to prevent unauthorized modifications to federal documentation. The error logs you've been reviewing show systematic attempts to bypass those safeguards, systematic attempts which was federal speak for intentional fraud. Monica's documentation included timestamps showing that Darren had tried 17 different methods to override authorization locks, including attempts to forge her digital signature on environmental impact documents. These weren't technical errors, Monica explained to Colin Reyes. These were deliberate attempts to submit fraudulent compliance documentation to federal agencies. The systems rejected those attempts and automatically reported them as required by federal oversight protocol. Colin nodded, taking extensive notes. Miss Reyes, your systems appear to have functioned exactly as designed, documenting unauthorized modifications and reporting compliance violations automatically. Can you walk us through the ownership structure of this compliance infrastructure? The question was crucial, determining whether Monica's systems were Orion Corps property or intellectual property that she had licensed to the company. Monica smiled for the first time since entering the building. The core compliance architecture is based on proprietary algorithms that I developed independently over 2 decades. The system's licensing agreement specifies that administrative access remains with the original developer pending formal knowledge transfer, which, as you know, never occurred. She pulled out a folder containing original contracts and intellectual property documentation that Leo Park had apparently never reviewed thoroughly. Intellectual property ownership. The revelation sent shockwaves through Orion Corps' legal team. Monica hadn't just built compliance systems, she owned them. The authorization locks weren't just security features, they were licensing enforcement mechanisms that prevented unauthorized use of proprietary regulatory software. Orion Corps had fired the person who owned the systems that their entire compliance infrastructure depended on, creating a legal catastrophe that compounded their regulatory problem. What would formal knowledge transfer require? Graham asked, though he suspected the answer would be complicated and expensive. Monica consulted her documentation with theatrical precision. Complete technical training for qualified replacement personnel, comprehensive documentation, regulatory relationships, systematic review of compliance protocols, and verification that the receiving organization understands federal oversight requirements. The process typically takes 18 to 24 months for organizations of Orion Corps' complexity. 18 to 24 months. Graham felt his stomach drop. Orion Corps couldn't survive 18 months of federal investigation and compliance suspension, but accelerating the knowledge transfer would require acknowledging that Monica's expertise couldn't be replaced by corporate restructuring. Company that had dismissed her institutional knowledge as outdated bureaucracy now needed that knowledge to survive federal oversight that could result in criminal charges. Alternatively, Monica continued, I could recommend that federal investigators review the compliance systems directly to understand how regulatory oversight should function in technology companies. The systems documentation I've provided includes comprehensive analysis of proper authorization procedures and evidence of what happens when those procedures are bypassed by unqualified personnel. The alternative was clearly not an alternative, it was a threat. Monica could provide federal investigators with complete technical documentation that would expose every shortcut Darren had attempted, every protocol he had ignored, every safeguard he had tried to bypass. The evidence of regulatory incompetence preserved in digital amber waiting for federal review that would determine whether Orion Corp faced civil penalties or criminal prosecution. Colin Reyes spoke carefully. Ms. Reyes, based on your technical analysis, do you believe the compliance violations we've documented represent systematic institutional problems or individual misconduct by specific personnel? The question was designed to give Monica an opportunity to limit Orion Corp's liability by blaming everything on Darren's incompetence. But Monica's answer was characteristically precise. The violations represent what happens when qualified compliance personnel are replaced by unqualified individuals during critical regulatory periods. Monica said, the institutional problems began when executive leadership prioritized family connections over regulatory expertise, but the specific violations were committed by someone who fundamentally didn't understand federal compliance requirements. She was drawing a distinction between corporate negligence and individual fraud without absolving either party of responsibility. Friday afternoon, Monica left Orion Corp headquarters for the second time in 2 weeks, but this time she was carrying signed documentation that transferred ownership of the compliance systems to federal oversight. Pending resolution of the investigation, Orion Corp would maintain operational access under federal supervision, but could no longer modify, author, or submit compliance documentation without explicit approval from Colin Reyes's office. The company that had dismissed Monica's expertise now operated under regulatory supervision that would last until they could demonstrate competent compliance management. The final irony came Saturday morning. Monica received a handwritten note from Graham Locke. Monica, you were right about everything. I should have listened to your concerns about Darren's qualifications. I hope you can forgive my poor judgment. Monica read the note twice, then filed it with the rest of her Orion Corp documentation, because she needed the apology, but because even inadequate recognition was worth preserving. She had spent 22 years building regulatory infrastructure that protected Orion Corp from exactly the kind of disasters they were now experiencing, and sometimes being right wasn't satisfying, just professionally necessary. Wednesday morning, Monica's coffee was interrupted by a phone call from Marcus Levinson, a federal energy procurement officer she had worked with during the Chicago Renewable Energy Initiative 3 years earlier. Monica, I've been following the Orion Corp situation through official channels, and I have a proposition that might interest you. His voice carried the careful neutrality of someone who was about to make an offer that couldn't be discussed through normal bureaucratic channels. I'm listening, Marcus, Monica said, settling back in her kitchen chair, watching Lake Michigan stretch toward the horizon from her apartment window. She had spent the past week fielding calls from industry contacts who wanted to understand how her compliance systems had exposed Orion Corp's regulatory failures, but Marcus was the first person to suggest that her expertise might be needed elsewhere. We're developing new oversight protocols for technology companies that handle federal energy contracts, Marcus explained. The Orion Corp case has highlighted some significant gaps in how we monitor compliance during leadership transitions. Your technical architecture become a case study in how regulatory safeguards should function when qualified personnel are replaced by unqualified individuals. Monica could hear the bureaucratic precision in his voice, but also genuine respect for the systems she had built. The proposition was intriguing, but Monica had learned to be cautious about federal consulting opportunities that sounded too good to be true. What specifically are you looking for, Marcus? She asked, and what kind of oversight structure would govern this work? Federal consulting could be professionally rewarding, but it also meant navigating bureaucratic requirements that made corporate compliance look simple by comparison. We want someone to design compliance infrastructure for the entire federal energy procurement system, Marcus said, understands how to build regulatory safeguards that maintain integrity regardless of personnel changes, corporate restructuring, or political pressure. The Orion Corp situation demonstrated that current oversight protocols are inadequate for complex technology companies. The scope was enormous, potentially affecting hundreds of companies and billions in federal contracts. Monday afternoon, Monica met Marcus at a coffee shop near the federal building downtown, away from the formal conference rooms, where official business was typically conducted. This is off the record for now, Marcus explained, but the Energy Department is developing new compliance requirements that would essentially mandate the kind of systems architecture you built at OrionCore. We need someone who understands both the technical requirements and the institutional politics. Monica almost laughed at the euphemism for corporate incompetence that had nearly destroyed a major federal contract. Marcus, are you asking me to build regulatory systems that prevent other companies from making the same mistakes that OrionCore made? The question was direct, but she wanted clarity about the scope and objectives before considering any formal proposal. Essentially, yes, Marcus admitted. But more than that, we want systems that can maintain regulatory integrity, even when companies prioritize image over expertise, connections over qualifications, or short-term profits over long-term compliance. The OrionCore case showed us that individual incompetence can create systemic risks that affect entire industries. He pulled out a folder containing preliminary specifications that looked remarkably similar to the safeguards Monica had embedded in OrionCore's compliance infrastructure. The specifications were comprehensive, requiring automated oversight protocols that could detect unauthorized modifications, flag compliance violations, and report systematic bypass attempts to federal agencies in real time. You want me to build a national version of what I built for OrionCore? Monica realized. Systems that protect regulatory integrity from corporate stupidity. Marcus nodded, appreciated at her characterization of the project scope. Tuesday morning, Monica received formal documentation outlining the federal consulting opportunity. The terms were generous, but more importantly, the work was meaningful, designing compliance infrastructure that could prevent other companies from experiencing OrionCore's regulatory meltdown. The consulting agreement included intellectual property protections that would prevent federal agencies from dismissing her expertise. OrionCore had dismissed her institutional knowledge. Camila called Tuesday evening, bursting with excitement about news coverage of the Federal Energy Department's new compliance initiative. Aunt Monica, they're calling it the Reyes Protocol. In the industry, publications, apparently federal agencies, are implementing oversight systems based on your OrionCore architecture. The recognition was satisfying, but Monica was more interested in the systematic changes that would prevent other compliance professionals from being dismissed for expertise that corporate leadership couldn't quantify. Wednesday afternoon, Monica signed the federal consulting agreement from her kitchen table, the same place where she had monitored OrionCore's compliance meltdown, in real time, through systems that documented every failed authorization attempt, every bypassed protocol, every moment of institutional betrayal. The work would be challenging, requiring her to scale regulatory safeguards from single-company infrastructure to national oversight protocols. But the intellectual challenge was exactly what she needed after watching 22 years of expertise get dismissed as outdated bureaucracy. Thursday morning brought news that made the federal consulting opportunity even more significant. Colin Reyes announced that OrionCore would be permanently blacklisted from federal energy contracts pending comprehensive compliance restructuring that could take years to complete. The company that has dismissed Monica's institutional knowledge would spend the foreseeable future trying to rebuild regulatory credibility under federal supervision, while she designed systems that would prevent other companies from making similar mistakes. The final satisfaction came Friday afternoon, when Tam Holloway called to thank Monica for building systems that had protected OrionCore's regulatory integrity even when executive leadership couldn't recognize the value of institutional expertise. Ms. Reyes, your compliance architecture saved the company from criminal prosecution by documenting violations were individual misconduct rather than systematic fraud, Tamika said. Without those safeguards, OrionCore would be facing federal charges that could have destroyed hundreds of jobs. Protection, not revenge. Monica had built systems designed to preserve regulatory integrity, not to punish corporate incompetence, but the effect was the same. Institutional knowledge couldn't be dismissed without consequences, and expertise couldn't be replaced by family connections without exposing companies to exactly the kind of regulatory disasters that destroyed corporate credibility. Monday morning, she would begin designing national compliance infrastructure that would systematically prevent other companies from prioritizing image over expertise. Weekend planning involved reviewing federal specifications and designing technical architecture for oversight systems that would monitor compliance across hundreds of energy companies. The work was exactly what Monica had been preparing for during 22 years at Orion Corp, building regulatory safeguards that could maintain integrity regardless of corporate politics, personnel changes, or executive incompetence. The systems she would design wouldn't just protect individual companies, they would protect entire industries from the kind of institutional failures that Orion Corp had demonstrated when qualified expertise was replaced by unqualified family members. The quiet architect was never out of work, especially when the foundation needed rebuilding. Monday morning, 6 months later, Monica Reyes sat in her new office, overlooking the Potomac River, reviewing compliance reports from 47 energy companies that were implementing the federal oversight protocols she had designed. The office was smaller than her old space at Orion Corp, but the windows faced east toward the sunrise, instead of west toward the sunset, and that seemed symbolically appropriate for someone who was building something new, rather than maintaining something old. The nameplate on her door read, Monica Reyes, Senior Advisor, Regulatory Infrastructure Design. Unlike her previous title, this one couldn't be replaced by corporate restructuring or family connections. The Federal Energy Oversight Initiative had grown beyond Marcus Levinson's original vision. What began as a response to Orion Corp's compliance failures had evolved into comprehensive regulatory program that affected every technology company seeking federal energy contracts. Monica's systems architecture now monitored compliance across multiple industries, providing real-time oversight that prevented the kind of institutional failures that had destroyed Orion Corp's regulatory credibility. Work was challenging, technically demanding, and professionally satisfying in ways that corporate compliance had never been. Her laptop chimed softly with an encrypted message from Tamika Holloway, who had been promoted to interim chief compliance officer at Orion Corp during the federal supervision period. Monica Reyes, thought you might want to see this morning's industry news. Orion Corp officially announced permanent closure of their federal contracts division, effective end of fiscal year. Attached was a press release that used carefully neutral language to describe what everyone in the industry understood was complete regulatory collapse caused by executive incompetence. Monica read the announcement with complicated emotions. Orion Corp's federal contracts division had employed nearly 300 people, many of whom she had trained personally over the years. The closure meant unemployment for compliance professionals who had done nothing wrong except work for a company that prioritized family connections over institutional expertise. But it also validated every safeguard she had built, every protocol she had implemented, every moment of methodical precision that corporate leadership had dismissed as outdated bureaucracy. The press release mentioned Graham Locke exactly once, describing him as former interim compliance director, who departed to pursue other opportunities, which was corporate euphemism for someone who had been quietly terminated after federal investigators determined that his modification attempts constituted attempted fraud. The investigation had concluded that Darren's actions were individual misconduct rather than systematic corruption, but the damage to Orion Corp's regulatory credibility was irreparable. Graham Locke had survived the federal investigation, but Orion Corp's board of directors had not survived the shareholder lawsuits that followed the contract suspensions. The company was being acquired by a Denver-based energy consortium that specialized in purchasing distressed assets and rebuilding regulatory compliance from the ground. Monica had been contacted by the acquisition team, who wanted to understand the technical architecture of the compliance systems, but she had politely declined to participate in Orion Corp's reconstruction. Camila called Tuesday afternoon, bursting with excitement about news coverage of the Federal Oversight Initiative. Arnianica, the Wall Street Journal published a feature story about regulatory reform in the tech industry, and you're quoted extensively. They're calling your system's architecture the gold standard for federal compliance oversight. Camila had been following the coverage closely, partly from family pride, but mostly from professional interest, as her own career in technology compliance had benefited significantly from her association with Monica's expertise. The Wall Street Journal article was comprehensive and surprisingly technical, explaining how Monica's embedded safeguards had prevented regulatory fraud, while documenting institutional failures that led to systematic reform. Reyes built more than compliance software. She built institutional memory that couldn't be deleted by corporate restructuring. The reporter had written, her systems remembered what executives chose to forget, that regulatory expertise requires years to develop and minutes to destroy. Institutional memory that was exactly what Monica had been trying to preserve during 22 years at ArrowCorp. The knowledge that environmental compliance wasn't just paperwork submission, but relationship management with federal agencies, understanding of regulatory intent and anticipation of how policy changes would affect technical requirements. The systems she had built weren't just software, they were digital embodiment of expertise that couldn't be replaced by enthusiasm or family connections. Wednesday morning brought news that made Monica smile for the first time in weeks. Colin Reyes had been promoted to Deputy Director of Federal Energy Compliance Oversight. His first initiative was expanding the Reyes protocol to include all technology companies seeking federal contracts, regardless of industry sector. Your system's architecture has proven so effective at preventing compliance failures that we're mandating similar safeguards across all federal procurement. He explained during their weekly coordination call, mandating similar safeguards meant that Monica's response to ArrowCorp's institutional betrayal was becoming federal policy, requiring every technology company to implement the kind of regulatory protections that could survive personnel changes, corporate restructuring, and executive incompetence. The quiet architect who had been dismissed for building systems that were too thorough was now designing mandatory infrastructure that would prevent other companies from making ArrowCorp's mistakes. Thursday afternoon, Mon received an unexpected visitor. Leo Park arrived at her office carrying a briefcase and the expression of someone who had spent months calculating professional consequences. Monica, I wanted to thank you personally for limiting ArrowCorp's liability during the federal investigation. Your testimony clarified that the compliance violations were individual misconduct rather than systematic fraud. He said, settling into the chair across from her desk. I told the truth, Leo. Monica replied. The systems worked exactly as designed, documenting unauthorized modification attempts and reporting compliance violations. Automatically, Darren's incompetence was individual, but the decision to replace qualified personnel with unqualified family members was institutional. She had spent months reviewing federal investigators' questions, and her answers had been consistently precise about the distinction between corporate negligence and individual fraud. Leo nodded uncomfortably. The board wanted me to ask whether you would consider consulting on the compliance restructuring that the acquisition team is implementing. They're willing to offer significant compensation for your expertise. Monica almost laughed at the irony. ArrowCorp had dismissed her institutional knowledge as outdated bureaucracy. Now they wanted to pay premium rates for the same expertise to rebuild what they had destroyed. Leo, the company made it clear that my approach to regulatory compliance was no longer valued at ArrowCorp, Monica said. I'm not interested in helping rebuild systems that should never have been dismantled in the first place. Besides, the federal oversight protocols I'm designing will prevent companies from prioritizing family connections over regulatory expertise. The refusal was polite but definitive. Monica had moved beyond ArrowCorp's institutional failures to work that prevented similar failures across entire industries. Friday evening, Monica walked past ArrowCorp's headquarters, the first time since her termination meeting, 8 months earlier. The building looked the same, glass and steel gleaming in the Chicago sunset. but the lobby directory showed significant changes. The Federal Contracts Division that had once employed 300 people now occupied half a floor. Compliance Department, that Monica had built over 2 decades, had been reduced to basic regulatory filing services overseen by federal supervision. The security guard recognized her and nodded respectfully. "Evening, Miss Reyes. Good to see you again," which was more acknowledgement than she had received from executive leadership during her final week at the company. The guard had probably read news coverage of the federal investigation and understood that Monica's systems had protected Orion Corp from criminal prosecution by documenting that compliance violations were individual misconduct rather than institutional corruption. Saturday morning, Monica sat in her kitchen reading weekend coverage of the federal oversight initiative that had grown from Orion Corp's compliance failures into comprehensive regulatory reform affecting hundreds of companies and billions in federal contracts. Coverage consistently credited her system's architecture with preventing regulatory fraud, while exposing institutional problems that led to systematic policy changes. Reyes didn't just build compliance software, she built accountability infrastructure that couldn't be corrupted by corporate politics, one analysis concluded. Accountability infrastructure that was precisely what she had been building during 22 years of methodical precision that corporate leadership had dismissed as outdated bureaucracy. The systems weren't just technical safeguards, they were institutional protection against the kind of executive arrogance that prioritized image over expertise, family connections over qualifications, short-term profits over long-term regulatory credibility. Sunday afternoon, Camila visited, bringing news and homemade tamales that reminded Monica of family dinners before corporate betrayal had complicated everything. "Aunt Monica, I wanted you to know that 3 of my colleagues have applied for positions in the Federal Oversight Initiative. They all mentioned that working with someone trained by Monica Reyes would be a career advantage." The recognition was satisfying. Monica was more interested in systematic changes that would protect other compliance professionals from being dismissed for expertise that corporate leadership couldn't quantify. "The industry has changed because of what you built at Orion Corp," Camila continued. "Companies can't just replace compliance officers with family members anymore. The federal oversight requirements are too comprehensive, too technical for anyone without proper training." Systematic change was exactly what Monica had hoped would result from Orion Corp's institutional failures, preventing other companies prioritizing nepotism over expertise and other compliance professionals from being dismissed for building systems that were too thorough. Monday morning brought the final piece of professional satisfaction. Monica had been waiting for. Marcus Levinson called with news that the Federal Oversight Initiative would be expanded internationally, providing technical assistance to other countries that wanted to implement similar regulatory safeguards. "Monica, your compliance architecture has become a model for institutional accountability that prevents corporate politics from compromising regulatory integrity. We're getting requests from energy ministries across Europe and Asia." International expansion meant that Monica's response to Orion Corp's betrayal would influence regulatory policy globally, preventing companies worldwide from making the same mistakes that had destroyed Orion Corp's federal credibility. The quiet architect who had been dismissed for building systems that were too methodical was now designing mandatory infrastructure that would protect regulatory integrity across international boundaries. Tuesday morning, Monica opened her laptop and began reviewing technical specifications for the next phase of federal oversight implementation. The work was challenging, requiring her to scale regulatory safeguards from national infrastructure to international protocols, but the intellectual satisfaction was profound. She was building systems that would prevent other compliance professionals from experiencing the kind of institutional betrayal that had ended her career at Orion Corp. The morning news included a brief item about Orion Corp's acquisition completion. The Denver-based consortium had purchased the company's remaining assets and planned to focus on state-level energy contracts that didn't require federal compliance oversight. Graham Locke had reportedly accepted a consulting position with a private equity firm that specialized in distressed corporate restructuring, which seemed appropriate for someone whose decision-making had created exactly the kind of institutional distress that required professional intervention. Darren Locke had disappeared from public view entirely, his LinkedIn profile had been deleted, his corporate biography removed from Orioncor's website, his speaking engagement at the Tech Leadership Conference cancelled. The man who had confidently dismissed 22 years of institutional expertise as outdated bureaucracy, had learned that regulatory compliance required more than corporate enthusiasm and family connections, but he had learned too late to prevent the systematic destruction of everything Monica had built. Wednesday afternoon, Monica received a handwritten note, forwarded through federal oversight channels. The envelope was addressed simply to the woman who built the vault, and contained a single page of careful script. Ms. Reyes, you probably don't remember me, but I attended your compliance training seminar in Denver 4 years ago. Your emphasis on building systems that maintain integrity, regardless of personnel changes, saved my company from making mistakes, similar to Orioncor's. We implemented your safeguard protocols and they prevented our new CEO from bypassing environmental compliance requirements during a leadership transition. Thank you for teaching us that expertise matters more than executive enthusiasm. Expertise matters more than executive enthusiasm. Monica smiled reading the note because it validated everything she had tried to teach during 2 decades of building regulatory infrastructure that could survive corporate politics, personnel changes, and executive incompetence. The systems she had designed weren't just technical safeguards, they were institutional protections against the kind of arrogance that prioritized image over substance, connections over competence, enthusiasm over expertise. Thursday evening, Monica sat on her apartment balcony overlooking Lake Michigan and reflected on the journey from Orioncor's conference room, where Graham Locke had dismissed her institutional knowledge, to federal oversight offices, where the same knowledge was being implemented as mandatory policy for hundreds of companies. The transformation had taken 8 months of federal investigation, regulatory reform, and systematic policy changes that would prevent other companies from prioritizing family connections over regulatory expertise. The satisfaction wasn't vindictive, because Monica had never sought revenge against Orioncor or Graham Locke or Darren Locke. The satisfaction was professional, watching systems work exactly as designed, protecting regulatory integrity, even when corporate leadership couldn't recognize the value of institutional expertise. The digital fortress she had built during 22 years of methodical precision had proven that some foundations couldn't be demolished without bringing down everything built on top of them. Friday morning, Monica received a final message that completed the narrative arc of institutional betrayal and professional vindication. Tamika Holloway sent a brief email with a single attachment. Ms. Reyes thought you should see the industry analysis of compliance failures over the past year. Orioncor is cited as the definitive case study in how not to manage regulatory expertise during leadership transitions. The attachment was a comprehensive report that would be studied in business schools and regulatory conferences for years as an example of how corporate arrogance could destroy institutional credibility in a matter of days. The report concluded with a section titled "Lessons Learned" that might as well have been Monica's professional obituary. For Orioncor, regulatory expertise requires years to develop and can be destroyed in minutes by executives who prioritize family connections over institutional knowledge. The Orioncor case demonstrates that compliance systems designed by qualified professionals will maintain integrity even when those professionals are replaced by unqualified individuals, but the institutional damage from such replacement decisions can be irreparable. Irreparable institutional damage was exactly what Monica predicted when Graham Locke prioritized family loyalty over regulatory expertise, but predictions were meaningless without evidence. and evidence required systems that could document institutional failures with forensic precision. The compliance infrastructure she had built during 22 years of methodical work had provided that evidence, preserving not just regulatory integrity but institutional accountability that prevented corporate politics from corrupting federal oversight. Saturday morning, Monica began planning the next phase of her federal consulting work, designing international regulatory protocols that would prevent companies worldwide from making Orion Corps' mistakes. The quiet architect who had been dismissed for building systems that were too thorough was now building mandatory infrastructure that would protect institutional expertise across global boundaries, ensure that regulatory compliance meant more than corporate theater, and institutional knowledge couldn't be dismissed without systematic consequences. The systems remembered everything, even when executives chose to forget, and that memory had become the foundation for regulatory reform that would outlast any individual career, corporate restructuring, or executive decision. The woman who built the vault had proven that some expertise couldn't be deleted by administrative decree, and some foundations were strong enough to support entirely new institutional architectures that prioritized competence over connections, substance over image, and regulatory integrity over corporate convenience. The quiet exit had become a systematic revolution, and Monica Reyes was building the infrastructure that would prevent other companies from forgetting what Orion Corps had learned too late. That institutional memory embedded in digital systems speaks louder than any executive announcement and lasts longer than any corporate reorganization. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.